Hey everybody, Cody Menz here with my annual video that I always kind of release this time of year for tanks kind of hanging around the World of Tanks PC client that have either been unreleased for quite some time and, quite a few new ones, just like this upcoming Tier 8 Japanese heavy tank, the Type 63, that has a new gun mechanic. So I'm going to give a quick little rundown for each specific tank here. In the video description below, you'll see kind of a list that you can click on each individual tank, because I'm going to start from the low tiers up to the high tiers. It gets really fast, going to tier 8, because there's not honestly that many tanks left in the low tiers that haven't been released. In any event though, let's kind of get started here. So this video, it's kind of the first I'm going to be releasing, where this is just a quick little look at each tank that isn't released, basically as of the Come and Test 1.22 update. That's about mid-August here in 2023. Now, some of these tanks have been in the video before, just like the T26CN here, which has been out for several years. Just one of these low-tier tanks that, maybe it'll end up being like a little filler, tank in one of the holiday ops boxes or gift reward tank. But this has been in the client for, I feel like 3, 4, 5 plus years. It's been a long time. Where kind of weird that it's just kind of hanging out there, because there aren't that many low tier tanks. Like, this is really the only tier 2 that hasn't been released yet. Now, jumping right to tier 3, we have the Kimi Otsu. Now, this tank was released temporarily on World Tanks Blitz. Apparently it's broken over in that game from my understanding, and they only sold it for a limited time. Can't get it anymore. Maybe that's changed, but it's never been out on World Tanks PC. Just your typical little tier 3 light tank here. Doesn't really look that broken. Statistically good in World Tanks PC here though. Now, the VK6501H is a tier 5 German premium heavy tank. This has been in the game client for 1 to 2 years. I think 2 years. More than 1, but I could be wrong there. This was kind of, I guess, slated to possibly be a holiday ops box tank or some sort of loot box filler tank. Basically your run-of-the-mill mid-tier German heavy, slash fat medium with thick armor kind of all around. It's got decent gun depression. Who knows if we'll ever see this, since, as we're kind of blowing through the low tiers here, since even Wargaming realizes that, low tiers, they don't really focus on them too much anymore. Next is the A43 Black Prince. This is a tier 6 version of the Black Prince, which we have at tier 7. Now, with the Churchills and Black Prince, kind of due for a rebalance and getting buffed here, soon, basically, in World of Tanks PC, this tank is not part of that, from my understanding. So that kind of leads me to believe that this, this was released like 4, I feel like, years ago in a client, that this is just kind of hanging out there to where maybe they'll throw it out there as some sort of freebie at some point. But as of right now, they probably don't have many plans to do this tank and bring it in. Now, getting into tier 7, kind of getting a little beefier here. There's the T34M-54. This, I believe, was added to the client back in 2022. T4485, this has been around for a very long time, and also the T44-122, which I believe was a special kind of gift for forum moderators, if I'm not mistaken, on like the EU and RU servers at some point. A tier 7 premium, basically with a gigantic gun on a T44 chassis. Not very good, because DPM, accuracy awful, and the penetration, but something quirky. Maybe they'll decide to release one of the versions of the 122 at some point, or even the T4485, basically a T44 down-tiered. But just like, the down-tiered Black Prince, I feel like there was a time where Wargaming released more of those tanks, kind of a down-tiered version of a tank, like, say, the Tiger 1, back when they were releasing all those. And it seems like they kind of got away from it. The most likely one, I feel like, out of this bunch we'll see at some point is the T34M-54, which is a hypothetical modernized version of the T34-85M, which we already have in the game at tier 6, which is a pretty good tank. Basically, thicker armor on this, and, essentially a tier higher. But with it kind of hanging out in a client, maybe it'll be like a little, you know, trinket or reward in like a loot box or something. Maybe the Halloween event, who knows, kind of coming up. Now, getting back into things, the last tier 7 here is the down-tiered rear turret version of the VK4502. This is the VK4502B7. This tank, nothing too special about it. You know, it's got like an okay gun, really poor mobility. There's the mobility. And armor isn't actually that great, to be completely honest. It's not awful, but it's also not fantastic. I believe the tier 8 VK4502, not the rear turret one, is getting a little bit of a buff, but this again I feel like falls into like a lot of these mid tiers where there was a time where Wargaming released these and people bought them, but I feel like they kind of shifted away from it. So maybe we'll get it, you know, thrown in at some point, because it doesn't really make sense, I feel like, for them to just delete the tank from the file and release it because it's done. Getting into tier 8. So some of these tanks, I still have TDs and tier 9 and 10s yet to add because I only could add 20 at a time. Some of these are new. Some of these have kind of been hanging out in the files for a while. Let's start with, so the LTS-85. Now this is a tier 8 Russian, most likely premium light tank. Now this tank definitely definitely a little different. Like I feel like it's a lot squarer than most Russian tanks that you see, but essentially it is a fairly modern design, 1960s, and when it comes down to it, it's got a pretty decent gun when it comes to, you know, alpha, compared to other Russian tanks. It's got that really made up or gun depression at -7 degrees, not great accuracy, and you know, obviously the armor's not super great, but it does have a little bit of angle to it. Like looking at the armor here, you know, for a light tank, it's got basically nothing, but who knows, maybe you'll be able to actually bounce something against super low caliber guns. But it's kind of this, it's a different shape than we've seen, but who knows what their plans are, because there's honestly a lot of Russian light tanks kind of hanging out there. The V range isn't too bad on this, camouflage isn't too great though. Trying to go through these as fast as possible too, so the video is not like 7 hours long. So moving past that, I'm going to leave that there just because it's a newer tank. This tank's been hanging around for a while. It's been in my videos for a few years now, the T44 Lightweight. This is one of those T44 tanks that they've had in the files for a very long time. This dates all the way back, I believe, to when they extended the light tank lines all the way up to tier 10, because originally they only went to tier 5 and then tier 8 and then 10. I believe this dates all the way back to that, so small hope we might see it, but honestly the tank is awful. If you look at the stats on your own, the tank is not very good whatsoever, so Wargaming would definitely have to rebalance it before they add it, because it's very bad for tier 8. Another newer tank here is the ST62 version 2. Now compared to the LTS, you'll see here higher pen, lower damage though, and this thing actually has a little bit of armor to it. Now this is a medium tank, and it's definitely got that like Russian, you know, size, and honestly it reminds me almost of the TL7 that we have. This is the American tier 9 tank destroyer, where it's this like really compact tank design. And it kind of looks like the 279E in a way with the armor scheme. Armor, you know, isn't fantastic, but for a little tiny, almost looks like a light tank, medium tank, it's not completely awful, and the thing is really freaking small. Now, who knows what their plans are? Like, this could be, you know, some sort of loot box tank or premium sale, battle pass tank, or, you know, maybe even holiday ops. Like, I'm going to be doing a video basically in the near future here, kind of going over my top, I guess, picks for what we could see in the holiday ops boxes in 2023 going into 2024 here. Now this tank, you know, the main thing that you're gonna want to notice here is really good top speed. Specific power is not crazy good on this, but it's also not awful to where it's this weird, you know, kind of like fast firing tiny tank, to where I like it. You know, some people might kind of moan, ugh, it's another Russian tank, but like, it's different, you know, it's different than what we have. CS52C. Now this tank, essentially it was added in back in 2022, and this tank, I thought it would have came out by now. You know, I thought it was a contender for either the Battle Pass um, or not yeah, Battle Pass or even the Holiday Ops boxes last year. It's basically, when it comes to Polish mediums, it's a little bit of everything, but honestly, it doesn't have really good armor whatsoever. And this tank specifically has that speed mechanic that the Tier 10 CS has in the tech tree, which that's the most unique factor for this. So I think we will see this at some point, just because it kind of has that uniqueness to it, and it seems pretty decently balanced. It doesn't seem too great, but where this could be one of those tanks where it finds its way into one of the loot boxes here in the fall, going into the winter, just because it has that kind of like unique, you know, feature. But it's been in the client for a year, so who knows, you know, exactly what their plans are. Next tank, if this ever comes out, I'm sure it's going to spawn a ton of memes. It's been in the game files, I feel like, since the beginning of the year, you know, almost going back to last year, where it hasn't been introduced, you know, in the past several months. It's been in for a little while. Essentially, the short version of the tank's name is just TITT. Don't really know, essentially, what that abbreviation is for, because the full name of it in like the game files is TITT Rozanov. Now, definitely has you know, two big rollers here in the front, which, you know, I don't know if that's why the acronym's there. You guys, your guess is as good as mine. But essentially, this thing is pretty decent DPM, good accuracy, good aiming time. Penetration and damage is a bit crappy, but the armor on the front of this thing, you know, it's a medium. It's not great, but it's definitely different, you know. It's got some space armor to it too with the rolling wheels, but it's also not awful. Like the turret front's actually pretty good. Looking at the cupolas here, like it doesn't really have any cupolas from what I can see. Now you do have that little top of the turret weak spot, it looks like, unless you can get it angled a little bit better. Somehow it has 6 degrees of gun depression, even though the turret's like really freaking tiny. Shocker. And basically the mobility is not too great on it. Like I know I'm kind of covering a little bit here, but all in all though, like this tank, I feel like we probably will see, because it seems pretty, you know, pretty unique, and it's been in the files, you know, I feel like approaching a year. Somewhat of a new tank, the next one here, the PR.68 P, a German premium tier 8 medium tank. Bit better alpha than we've seen thus far for tier 8 tanks. Bit better penetration. Germany usually is known for that for a lot of their tanks. It's got really good gun elevation and decent gun depression and good accuracy. Armor, not too good, but it does have a little bit of a wedge on the front, we'll see here in a second. And mobility isn't bad. It's actually pretty good, above average. Now, looking at the tank itself, it definitely seems like a bit more of a, I guess, modern tank, you know, than you see at most at tier 8, and doesn't really look here like it looks like it says it should have a hydropneumatic suspension, but it doesn't look like they added that into the game here. This is essentially just a blueprint, I guess, like plan tank. Now the armor factoring in, seems like Wargaming has kind of been on a roll when it comes to you know, tanks with shovels, you know, on the front. It does have a little bit of space armor at 20 millimeters, so that'll help against basically heat rounds, but it's not really going to help you against AP, because the armor here is pretty bad. Like the turret, a couple of good spots here, but nothing too fantastic. At least the cupolas are a little tiny, but this is essentially more mobility and accuracy. It's labeled as a sniping medium tank, which seems like it'll fit that role. I feel like this could definitely be one of the tanks we kind of see thrown in an event somewhat soon, because this has kind of been, I feel like, you know, kind of marked off and added in here in 2023. Now, I threw these tanks in here. They were released on the Asian server, you know, basically a while ago, like last fall. The Udarniy was released there, and then you also have a slightly different version, the Object 259A, which actually got a little bit of a rebalance when it comes to 1.22 here. Maybe just in the Lestov region, but they're doing something to the 259A where some focus is being put on it, but it's a little strange that we haven't seen either of these tanks, specifically the Udarniy, released outside of the SEA region. You know, that was I think it was a fall event that they released them last year, along with the Jagdtiger prototype at Tier 9 and the TL1 or TL7 that we do have. So these are tanks where I feel like pretty high chance that we see them on NA and EU at some point. It's just, I guess, a little strange that, you know, they haven't come out by now. These tanks, though, typical Russian tanks, where it's got a little bit of everything. Bad view range, but otherwise the view range and gun depression, really good gun. You know, damage-wise, not too poor on the DPM, but good armor and mobility is decent. The 259A version has a harder hitting gun at the cost of some DPM, and the armor is a little bit different too. So I'm gonna knock those tanks off though. The WZ-113-2. Now this tank, I forget if it was this or the other Tier 8 Chinese heavy tank. They've been in the files for a little while too, where one of them I believe was tied to, or at least rumored, I don't know if it actually came out, their version of kind of Watt Plus, the exclusive tank, but I'm not exactly sure what surmount basically came of that. Now this tank does have pretty much no gun depression, 4 degrees, which is terrible. It's pretty much one of the lowest in the game. Otherwise though, you're essentially getting the Tier 10, you know, 113, bumped all the way down to Tier 8. So the thing's actually got pretty decent armor, but you're paying a lot for it when it comes to, you know, the gun and stuff, that where, you know, the thing's basically like an armored, fast, you know, mobile heavy, but you're paying a lot to kind of have that platform. Almost like a super up-tiered version of, I guess, the KV 220, you know, -2 at Tier 5. I'm pretty sure Tier 5, yeah, that premium, where you have like a KV3 hull, you know, down tiered quite a bit. Now, getting into, so there's the WZ-111-6 here. This tank's also kind of been hanging around in game files for a little bit. Essentially a different version of the WZ-111, where this one, different gun, you know, kind of average DPM and accuracy, but you've got different armor kind of going around with it here, where it's got a little bit of shielding on it, and it's kind of a mashup, I believe, of, if I'm not mistaken, it's kind of a mashup of, yeah, the Czechoslovakian turret from, I believe, the Tier 8 or the Tier 9. I forget which one exactly. But this one, I don't think we've really seen the light of day, to where who knows what their plans are. Could be one of these, you know, they throw it into like an auction, or kind of a loot box, is like not the premier tank, but kind of a, you know, secondary, you know, tank, because it's really just adding 2 tanks together. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on a 703 version 2 100mm, but this tank's been on a while, to where I could definitely see them putting this into like an auction at some point, because this tank, essentially it's the premium that we have already, the 122mm version, but this was back when they were testing, should they do 100mm or 122 for the premium, and this one lost out. I feel like it's hanging in the game files, where this, you know, it would be an easy tank for them to basically sell to people. There's nothing broken about it, you know, essentially it's just changing the gun. Now, the tank that I started off with, the Type 63. So this is a upcoming Tier 8 premium Japanese heavy tank. This tank features a new, essentially gun mechanic, where you have different gun attributes, which I don't think it shows, or it does show it here in the side here. So you have a gun cooling time. So this essentially, you have your reload at 10.5 seconds, and then your gun cools 13.56 seconds, where your accuracy improves, from 0.36 down to 0.27. So pretty significant, change there. Most likely this is going to be a feature for the tech tree line for the Japanese heavies as well. But this is essentially, I think, a pretty good candidate for holiday ops tank, because usually Wargaming likes to drum up, hype when it comes to essentially a new tank coming out around Christmas and the holidays, when it comes to whether it's in the holiday ops boxes, or sometimes they do a release right beforehand. Who knows what they'll do this year, but I think this is a pretty good shoe-in that we will see it basically before 2024 gets here. Now, aside from that new mechanic, this tank does have pretty good gun depression, to where, from my understanding, to 14 degrees, I think it's 12 degrees closer to 12 degrees across most of the tank, to where I don't think it actually gets down to 14 degrees across a lot of the tank, but I could be wrong. It does have this weird kind of hole there. I don't know exactly how that's supposed to work, because it's it is an oscillating turret, but it is a odd design. Basically, I could see this baiting so many people. Conspiracy theories about how their shot landed directly on this tank and it didn't do anything. It just magically disappeared. I could see that coming. But otherwise, the gun elevation's pretty awful. That's typical of oscillating turrets, though. Not great when it comes to the damage. Like 360 is actually not too great. But being a tier 8 heavy, it's not awful. But it's got pretty decent penetration. When it comes to the armor, like when you're hull down, like this thing's gonna be pretty hard, to damage. So it's, that's gonna be one of the strengths of the tank. It doesn't really have too much armor when it comes to like the hull, so it's gonna, I guess, be a single shot accurate version of the Kronwagen almost. Kind of that type of gameplay potentially. Like the view range is okay on it, and then when it comes to the speed, it's not very fast. So it just seems like a different game mechanic, and who knows how, I guess, useful this will be, just because I feel like the main downside for this tank is going to be, it seems pretty, I guess, specific, for its role, which might come back to bite it if you're against, a more versatile heavy tank that isn't just, based on accuracy and hold down, but something different, unique. So I'm all for that as long as it's balanced. Getting into, so adding in the other tanks that didn't fit here, trying to do this video in one take. So I'm just adding in the tanks, some that have been hanging around in the files for a while, and other ones that are new. So I'm going to start with the tier 8 tank destroyers here. So there's the XM66F. Now this tank, somewhat newer in the game files, where it seems a lot of the American tanks they've been adding, like say the TL7 in recent memory, super tiny and like petite. This one definitely, the turret seems a little bit too big for this tank, where, so this tank, a tier 8 tank destroyer, most likely a premium. I think it's pretty likely we see this, by 2024, but this could also, potentially, make its way, I guess, going into next year as well. What you have here essentially, though, so I'm just trying not to laugh because the tank looks ridiculous in my opinion. It's your typical American where DPM's not bad. Like this one, I feel like they still need to balance it a bit more, because the DPM's pretty good, damage per shot's okay for tier 8. Penetration's nothing crazy good, but it's not awful. I feel like typical American tank, though, the accuracy is not perfect. Good gun depression. I'll get into the armor in a second. Mobility is just iffy, nothing too crazy to see otherwise, stat-wise. But the tank, essentially when you're going to be able to hold down, as long as you're hiding a hole, which is pretty weak, it gets pretty good, unless you're shooting like up in this area, when it comes to the typical American cupolas, but they're not big. It doesn't have some, gigantic, 3-story tall cupola that ruins the entire tank. So this tank's going to be pretty well armored, where like it does have a few holes, just kind of seeing here, especially if you're getting shot by like higher tiers and stuff like that, and like the flat bits. Like this looks like it's going to be the main weak spot area. But overall, it looks like it's going to be a pretty decent tank, and fit pretty well. Whereas, this being kind of that hull down, single shot tank compared to the previous Japanese heavy, I feel like it works a little bit better for a tank destroyer because your team isn't, I feel like, as screwed sometimes, not having a heavy tank that can kind of brawl it out and hold spots, and like, beefy, brawling tank. So this one will be pretty interesting, to where I feel like with Wargaming focusing a bit more on the NA and EU markets, we'll definitely see this sooner than later, and along with like the PR.68. Now the Panzer or Kanonenjagdpanzer. Now this is the 8.8 version, the original version that they sold, and this tank is so horrible that they stopped selling it and put a different gun on it and sold it to us again with a 105mm gun. I feel like this is another strong candidate for them potentially releasing at some point in like an auction, or basically some sort of sale to us, just because the tank is not that good, but it could be a collector's tank. So why not kind of sell it to the players and let them spend tons of gold or credits or whatever the hell they want to make us pay for it. And to kind of finish out tier 8 here is the Jagdtiger Prototype, which this tank, basically on the SEA server, it was released alongside the TL7 and the Udarniy, last year. Haven't seen it in any other servers yet, NA, EU. So definitely odd that we haven't seen it, to where, is it great? It's nothing too spectacular, but it's also not that bad, It's got a pretty good gun. It definitely lacks mobility. That's the main downside of the tank. I guess notice here that my mobility is getting covered. But this tank is not very fast. It goes under 40 kilometers an hour, has really bad specific power. But it's a Jagdtiger at tier 8, where, it's a different version than the 8.8 centimeter that we have. So overall, hopefully we see this at some point, just because it's been out on the SEA server for a while. Now, getting into tier 9 here for some unreleased tanks, because we got some of them that's already been released. Tiger Mouse, the tier 3 or T3 Jager, I believe. Has some weird names here. Like, I am definitely screwed. So there's the new British medium tank, and yeah, that's most of it. Like the SU-122 has been in for a while. Where we'll go here, but yeah, I'm gonna be completely screwed because there's a lot of funky names getting added in here. So we'll kind of start off with the, let's see, Swedish tank destroyer. I'm gonna try my best. The Lätt Stridsfordon 120. You guys will probably yell at me in the comment section. Definitely looks Swedish when it comes to this design, and really good gun depression, decent gun elevation, but the gun depression is going to be the main thing for this tank. Really good gun. DPM's okay, but nothing fantastic. Surprising element is the dispersion, where I'm assuming when you switch into siege mode, it's going to be like the other Swedish TDs, to where it's going to essentially be improved. Now this, I could probably, if we don't see it in a loot box being sold, like, I'm gonna get into the comparison here just to see the stats a little bit better. If we don't see this like in one of the loot boxes, I guess we might see this as a battle pass tank next year, where it looks decent. It's got good camo. The main thing that sticks out to me is the accuracy, which most likely is going to be pretty darn good in the siege mode. But the thing doesn't really have any armor. It kind of seems like an up-tiered UDES 3 compared to the tier 9 and 10 Strebs that have a little bit thicker armor going for them. K91-2 here. Now this tank's kind of been in the files for at least 1 or 2 years. A little strange it hasn't been released. Most likely, it's nothing, I guess, crazy exciting. That's what my main thing that I've been saying for the past year plus, because we already have you know, a couple other K91s where, you know, this tank isn't exactly, I guess maybe we'll see it at some point, but I don't see where they release it in a loot box or even as like a battle pass tank, just because it's not crazy exciting. Whoops, did not want to click on that. Going to PZ2 is not a new tank. Now getting into a funky tank here. So this is the TS-60 Assault Tank Destroyer, an American tank. There's a lot of like tier 8 9s and a couple 10s, like, but there's a lot of funky tanks they're releasing. This is, I guess, a pretty good contender, you know, for seeing at the end of the year here, or potentially going into, you know, kind of like battle pass, you know, for next year. But the TS-60 is kind of odd for an American tank. Like, it almost looks like, you know, the FV, you know, 215B183 design, you know, being curve mounted tank. Now, when it comes to the armor scheme on this thing, because you're looking at the armor values over here, it doesn't really have great, you know, armor when it comes to like the lower glacis. Upper glacis gets a little tougher, and the turret's, you know, okay. Where the armor, and it has this like really cupola, so like it's got armor against, I guess, lower tiers, but does it have armor against tier 9s and 10s? You know, it's debatable. You know, you'll get some bounces with the turret, but I feel like it'll be a little tough unless you're side scraping. Now, what this tank does have though, 400 damage gun, decent penetration, but nothing, you know, crazy. You know, a tier 9 for a TD, but the turret does traverse pretty well. Like, it's not super limited, not great gun depression. With the thing right now, it's got 3,300 DPM. Dispersion's you know, definitely American 0.4, so nothing fantastic. But it's just this weird, like getting back into here, in case anyone's looking at the stats, which I guess I probably could move my webcam, or at least reduce it down here a little bit to make it a little bit better. But the mobility on this tank isn't great by any means. So TS-60 here, which I guess at this point I probably could delete some of these other tanks. So let me do that. So TS-60, where this thing's basically armored and damage per minute, and the rear turret's definitely going to be a hindrance for you. But the mobility, you know, 35 kilometers an hour top speed, not a great specific power, and this thing isn't going to win any, you know, camouflage contests as well, because the camo's not very good. So definitely quirky for an American tank, and one of the more unique tanks, where being a rear turret, I'm not a fan of it, but I'll play this because it's pretty unique. I'd rather Wargaming release unique tanks than, you know, overpowered tanks. This tank is being talked about a lot right now. The Tiger Mouse, I think, so is probably my, I guess, best guess, you know, for it being like one of the featured like loot box tanks or battle pass tanks, but I think more loot box than anything going into the holiday season, just because I feel like a lot of people would like this, you know, Tiger Mouse. This thing would sell, you know, to their #1 target audience, you know, being EU now. Basically what you're getting, pretty good hard-hitting gun, decent penetration, good accuracy, and also the DPM, not great, you know, it's a bit low. But overall, you know, the armor on this thing, as you might expect, it's not, you know, it's not unbeatable, but it's thicker, you know, it's pretty darn good. Like, upper glacis is good, lower glacis, like, if you can angle it, is pretty decent. Sides, not too bad, but it does have like these really thin weak spots on the side, where kind of dating back to like the older like Mouse and like German heavy tank designs before Wargaming start throwing on crazy armor values to try to combat premium rounds. And when it comes to the turret, it's got a pretty decent turret front. It's not going to protect you obviously against you know, tier 10 throwing gold and stuff at you, but it's pretty darn good. It's going to protect you against most things. So I feel like this tank it's actually pretty decent, you know, right now, to where who knows if it's finalized stat-wise, but the main thing going against this is the mobility, which is awful. 32 kilometers an hour, and the specific power is 10. So it's not great when it comes to that. Basically, you're just getting a pretty beefy block of armor with a decent gun on it. But I think this tank, is definitely going to be very popular whenever it comes out, if not just for like the name attached to it. UDES 3, this tank's been in the files for at least, I think, 2-3 years at this point. I'm surprised we haven't seen it, though, where this, I feel like, is a pretty good contender for them kind of mopping things up and kind of throwing out some of the leftover tanks at some point in an auction, or God knows what. I don't think it'll be a battle pass tank though, but maybe, maybe I'd be shocked to see that. Nothing too great about the tank. Like, it doesn't have great armor. It's this weird kind of blend, I guess, between a Swedish TD and a medium tank. But I feel like this tank, it's probably going to be sitting in the files for a bit longer. Object 590. Now, this tank was introduced at some point about 1.5 2 years ago, where this was a pretty good guess, for either Holiday Ops last year or Battle Pass, and they've done nothing with it. I think we will see this at some point, just because it's an auto-reloading Tier 9 Russian medium tank, where I feel like this would be a very easy tank for them to release, and it doesn't even have to be good. It would just sell based off of being a Tier 9 auto-reloading Russian medium tank. So I think we'll see this at some point, but it'll probably, I think it, it might get reworked into a Tier 9 premium tank at some point, and statistically it probably won't do too well. It looks modern, but I don't think it'll perform too well, and it'll go off of kind of the WoW feature. SU-122-54. This tank has been in the files for years upon years, back when they removed it from the tech tree. I'm hopeful one day we see it again at some point. Essentially, this tank has pretty good mobility, and at the same time, armor, it's not great, but it's a little bit bouncy, and it's got a pretty decent, fast-firing gun. But who knows? Wargaming seems to have forgotten about it. I feel like it would be a pretty easy pick for them to add in at some point. On to the next unique German tank. So a Tier 9 tank destroyer, the T3. Let me pronounce this hopefully somewhat correctly here, but basically I think the full name is the KJPZ, or I'm assuming Kanonenjagdpanzer T3 Jager. Essentially 1972. Main features: high top speed, 120mm gun, and basically a turret. And yeah, it's different. Doesn't look like a German tank destroyer at all. To me, it looks more like a medium tank, but this one I don't think is finished being balanced. This is one of the newer tanks kind of hanging out there. Has absolutely no armor to speak of whatsoever. Like, you will not basically find a lick of armor on this thing unless you get really lucky and somehow someone like shoots you and just misses, because you're getting pinned otherwise. But basically, this tank has a crazy gun when it comes to decent damage. Low for a tank destroyer though. Really good base penetration, really good accuracy, decent damage per minute, okay gun depression, and otherwise it's pretty mobile. It's definitely not the fastest Tier 9 tank destroyer out there, but it's got a little bit of everything, to where it's kind of like, I guess, not. It's basically like a light tank destroyer, medium-esque tank. But this tank, I feel like, will definitely be pretty popular, maybe a battle pass tank, more so than being sold as a premium tank, just because I feel like the Tiger mouse kind of beats it out in that regard. Now, the Object 752, wanted to note this tank. So this has been in the files for quite some time, but it actually got its stats changed somewhat recently this year, about mid-year. They tweaked it a little bit, and I forget if it was just on the Leicester region or Wargaming as a whole, but interesting seeing them kind of revisit the tank and touch it a little bit, to where this could be something maybe they release for like the Halloween event this year. or going into like an auction or something next year. But basically, it's a auto loading, Russian oscillating turret. Tier 9 heavy tank, a little bit of a mouthful. To where it's got pretty thick armor on this gun shield, not so much behind it, and then it's got pretty good rounded armor here to where it's pretty solid. And otherwise, mobility, it lacks a little bit in the mobility department, which is its main downside, and accuracy and damage per minute. Last but not least, tier 10, if you're still with me here, because this video is always a mouthful. At tier 10, we essentially have three tanks, three tanks, excluding the Waffentrager that's kind of hanging out. So adding these heaps in here, and I'm double checking that I'm not forgetting anything. I hope I'm not forgetting anything. It's like that's the new British medium tank, and I think that's about it, because there's so many random tier 10s just kind of hanging out in the client. This one is kind of strange. WZ-111 test. Essentially who knows what they're doing with this. I could see them adding in a new WZ model with a special 3D style. This was added in at some point, basically this update or common test, but that's my guess for this, is essentially laying the groundwork for some sort of event or 3D style. Otherwise though, so the MBT-B has been in the files for quite some time, approaching I think a little over a year here. This to me is a contender for either a new clan war tank or the assembly shop tank early next year. Basically January, February for NA, EU, pretty much any reason or region. It's been rebalanced a bit to where initially it looked a little bit too good, to where it's got pretty decent, upper glacis armor, lower glacis is a bit weak. The turret has all sorts of things, like you can't damage up here, and it's got pretty decent armor all around, where the thing's funky. There's no lying about that. The thing does not look like a typical tank in Proto Tank's PC. It says it's 1964, but it's got stuff hanging off of it. Stuff maybe it has a microwave or something too. Who knows? But overall, though, this tank, decent single shot gun. Good gun depression at 10 degrees, good accuracy, good damage per minute. Mobility is pretty decent. It's kind of big, and the view range is actually really good. It's 420 base, or 420 meter base view range here, where it kind of looks to me, it's kind of like the American version of the T95 FB 4201 Chieftain, which they are currently trying to rebalance a little bit. So maybe they release this as a new clan war tank going into next year, or the assembly shop. I think it's either or, and I think we will get it in the first half of 2024. But this tank looks really good. I could see them, honestly, though, tweaking it a little bit before release. Saving grace with it compared to, say the Chieftain is, it does have some weak spots, against tier 10s, even hull down, and the hull armor is definitely, while the upper glacis is decent, I feel like this tank isn't broken. It's very good, but not broken. Somewhat newer tank here. So this is a tier 10 light tank, where that's where either the MBT-B or this tank I feel like will be our assembly shop tanks, the LKpz.70 K. I think it would be pretty interesting doing a light tank, since we haven't gotten that, before, essentially as an assembly shop tank, where I think this is more likely for that than the MBT. Now, this tank, if you're looking over here, the gun depression, 17 degrees of gun depression. That's insane. The gun on this thing is pretty good. It's super accurate. DPM's, decent at 2,000, but nothing, crazy. It's got a pretty well-rounded gun, but the gun depression is what really stands out here, and basically the lack of a turret. This thing is basically just a tank hull with a gun, strapped on top of it. Armor-wise, you know, this thing doesn't really have any armor to speak of. It's a light tank. The main thing going for it is it basically you're just driving around a hole with a gun on top. So it's really tiny. You know, camouflage is okay, but nothing, you know, groundbreaking. Like throwing, I just want to throw this on for my sake here. Like throwing on something, say like a Manicore, and tweaking essentially the stuff that I have on this so it's a little bit better of a comparison with just 100% crew. Will give you a pretty good sense where the LK, even though it's really, really tiny, the camouflage still isn't, you know, as good as a Manicore, but it's not bad either. Where, you know, this tank, you know, kind of going into this, where it looks like it's going to be a little bit more chaotic driving around, where that's where I'm leaning towards this being an assembly shop tank. But it looks really cool to me, where compared to a Manicore, it's going to be, I guess, more sneaky, shooting people, running around, popping over little hills and stuff. It's going to be annoying, but it's definitely good to see like the thing's not absolutely broken and just outclasses all other light tanks in every other way. But in any event, I covered a lot of things here. I'm approaching about 50 minutes here. I'm at like 46 minutes. In another video, if you made it this long, you know, I'm going to be essentially going over, you know, my picks for the, you know, essentially holiday ops, you know, going into like the, you know, Halloween and assembly shop and, you know, events basically in the end of 2023 here and also 2024, to where I feel like the second half of this video, and especially some tanks here at the end, are definitely going to be, I guess, more of the, I guess, highlights going into this season, to where most likely I think we'll get at least 2 new tier 9 tanks, one for holiday ops, one possibly for the Halloween event, and then essentially going into next year, at least 1 new tier 10, you know, for the assembly shop. But I think they might surprise us with another Clan 4 tank. In any event, though, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and, you know, it's kind of interesting, you know, seeing some tanks hanging out in a client, and I hope to see you in the next video. Have a good one. See you around.